Okay, great. We go to the next slide. Um, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. I'm Tony Bunger. I'm the CMMC manager here, responsible for the program at Redspin. I'm also CMMC provisional assessor here. Have over 20 years experience conducting various assessments, including ISO and NIST. And now we'll be starting to do some CMMC assessments here real soon. Over to you, Marty.
Thank you, Tony, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone as well. I'm so happy to be here because I think this is a topic that healthcare entities don't always think about for them because of its relative newness and because that it's currently applicable to DoD engagements. But my name is Marty Arvin. I'm an executive advisor at Synergistic. I do a lot of work in our privacy, security, and compliance space. And I'm looking forward to helping our team at Redspin support the CMMC certification process. So with that, Tony, you want to tell the folks a little bit about Redspin?
Sure. We'll go to the next slide. And yes, Redspin was acquired by Synergistic in 2015, and many of you on this call, I'm sure, are very familiar with Synergistic. However, Redspin was rooted in healthcare as well and delivered technical testing, red team, and assessment services to many providers, payers, and business associates. So there's a strong connection between with healthcare between Synergistic and Redspin, which is obviously a division of Synergistic. So today, Redspin serves clients in various industries, including defense contracts, the technology, manufacturing, energy, and utilities, as well as financial services. So you can see Redspin takes on a broad size sector here. So our services include our assessment, our ability to assess, manage, build, and validate services offerings. And one thing that makes us unique is that we are the first authorized C3PAO to conduct CMMC assessments. We're also an RPO, which means Registered Provider Organization, to provide CMMC readiness consulting. And we are also one of the first licensed training providers to authorize to conduct training classes for certified CMMC professionals, also known as CCP, and certified CMMC assessors, also known as CCAs. So you can see that Redspin has really dove deep into the CMMC ecosystem, and we're very excited to go ahead and start performing and conducting these services on behalf of the government. So we're going to tie this into healthcare organizations. Many of you may realize that a lot of healthcare organizations are looking to send members of their team through the CCP training so that they can support their efforts of becoming CMMC certified themselves. Our first class will start in November, so please look out for us. Look out for schedules so you can register if you desire to register to take the CCP training class so you can become CCP certified. All right, next slide. I'll turn it over to you, Marty, for a poll.
Thank you. So we'd like to get to know a little bit about who you are, who our audience is today. So we're going to go through a few polling questions here. To answer the polling questions, if you will click the poll tab on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see poll number 1. So you'll also see the Vote Now button when that opens. So if you'll open that Vote Now button and vote whatever's applicable to you as far as what your role is. And then as those votes are coming in, we'll start to share those results and kind of share with you who we have in the audience today. So it looks like right now, as the votes are coming in, the vast majority of individuals are in the other category. We don't have any chief information security officers currently that have identified themselves. We have a few chief compliance officers, a few chief privacy officers, chief information officers, no other executives. And again, right now, most people are identifying as some other role. So let's go to the next slide and take our next polling question that will help us get to know you a little better. So again, same process, go to the polling question and click the Vote tab. And as we look at this, if you respond and tell us what you think about whether you know or your organization is going to need to be CMC certified. And as we look at that, it might explain why many of you are on the call, because we have about 13% of you who say yes, you know that you are going to need to be. About 24% currently say no. It'll be interesting to see if you still feel that way after the presentation. It might be the same. And then the rest of you, about 63% or 2/3 of you say you don't know yet. And so hopefully we'll help you clarify that through the course of the presentation. Now, if we go back to the last polling question, and the next slide, please. So this question is for those of you who do know you're going to have to be, or even for those of you who are not sure. I assume you don't feel like you're very well prepared, but you know, how prepared do you think you are in getting ready for this if you know it's applicable to you? And obviously you're probably not at all prepared if you're not sure if it's applicable to you. And not surprisingly, since many of you said you weren't sure if it was applicable to you, we have a small percentage that say they feel like they're well prepared, an even smaller percentage that says they're getting there, a few more that say you're starting the process, but again, the vast majority of you are saying you don't know at all. So again, I hope that as we go through the presentation, you get a better understanding of what it is and whether it applies to you. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So let's go to the next slide. And Tony, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. So according to the polls, they were very, very eye-opening to me. And so what we're going to do here is go through some of the basics of the CMMC model. Now, some of you said you're well prepared in getting there, which means you're probably familiar with the model itself, but I'm going to take you through the model. And next we'll go into what our lessons learned are from when we went through the assessment ourselves. And then we'll wrap it up with talking about how can you prepare yourself to get ready for CMMC certification. And what we're going to do is sprinkle in some healthcare ideas here, you know, what it means to you. I saw there's a lot of folks that's within the privacy in that first poll there. You know, what does it mean for you when it comes to CMMC? So we're going to jump right in. Next slide, please. And we're going to talk about the threats first to the defense industrial base. We'll be talking about the defense industrial base, and we're going to also talk about how healthcare fits into that. But there are two major threats to the defense industrial base. One is ransomware, that's really geared to where the threats are attempting to disrupt the supply chain. And the other one is the theft of sensitive data, specifically controlled unclassified information, or CUI, as some of you may be well aware of. So if you've been keeping up in the news, ransomware attacks are continuing to rise. You know, ransomware is an inexpensive and efficient method of shutting down an organization. And adversaries are attempting to shut down or disrupt the supply chain within the defense industrial base. You see here some statistics, you know, according to the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report in 2020, cyber attacks ranked first among global human-caused risks, and Cybersecurity Ventures predicts that in 2021, which is 3/4 of the way over, cybercrime will cost the world 11.4 million each minute. So that's a lot of damage. As you can see, reading the news almost every day, you hear some level of ransomware attacks successful, whether at your local municipal government or all the way up to your global corporations. Next slide. We'll talk a little bit about the supply chain theft. So it's important to understand why CMMC was created in the first place. The adversaries are targeting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of sensitive government data throughout the entire defense supply chain. And we're going to talk about, you know, what does that mean? It's not just within the DoD sector, or it also reaches out to other sectors like healthcare. So the defense industrial base, it's a target-rich environment, and adversaries have been in the past and continually are successful exfiltrating CUI from DoD contractors, or disrupting the supply chain through ransomware. So the following here, as you see on here, the recent examples of attacks on the defense industrial base. Note that the Microsoft example, which occurred just in last March here, shows that the adversaries are not just targeting military weapon systems or large complex software systems. These adversaries are also focusing on the exploitable targets such as people and facilities to make their way to the sensitive information that they're looking for. So the defense industrial base itself is not the only target. The theft of this information from all the nation's industrial sectors, including healthcare, due to malicious cyber activity is threatening national and economic security. So this is a serious problem. The bottom line is that allowing these adversaries to continue to target and successfully exploit this data hinders the nation's ability to maintain a strategic advantage. So what is being done about it? Next slide, please. We have this thing called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification that the DoD came about and developed. The CMMC model was developed to require certification via an independent third-party review vice the self-attestation, which did not work in the past. And in the past, this is as early as 2019. So the intent of CMMC is to avoid the future losses due to cybersecurity breaches within the government supply chain. So you notice I use the word government as opposed to just the defense supply chain. So as a result, every DoD contractor or government contractor that is under a DoD contract, and we'll talk later about maybe possibly other federal agency contracts, whether you're a prime contractor or subcontractor, you will require a CMMC certification from an independent certified CMMC assessor to assess the contractor's ability to protect sensitive government information such as CUI and FCI. So we'll be talking about CUI and FCI here, and shortly I'll provide you a little description of what CUI is. So basically the success of a compliance model, such as the CMMC model that you see here, depends on the contractor's understanding and ability to protect sensitive government data while stored, processed, and or transmitted within a controlled environment. So allowing adversaries to continue to target this data and successfully extract that data hinders the nation's ability to maintain a strategic advantage. This is a strategic national security issue. I think we know who some of these adversaries are. It's part of their strategy, national strategy to extract sensitive data from other governments for their strategic advantage. Next slide, please.
So Tony, before you move on, I just want to comment on the prior slide and thinking through, if you think about this, it really isn't surprising that they did something about this because as you pointed out on the prior slide, self-attestation wasn't working. And what we have seen here is kind of a comparable model to the HIPAA security rule, because while the HIPAA security rule doesn't have this same kind of certification model that CMMC is, what OCR has seen is that a lot of covered entities aren't really doing strong risk assessments that are required by the rule. So they've allowed organizations to self-assess and not required that they do any sort of certification. But when they've done their audits, what they found is that under those audits, organizations haven't done risk assessments at all, perhaps, or if they have done them, then they weren't adequate under the rule. And so Tony will talk about this a little more later, but as you think about this and as we go through the presentation and you look at it and say, oh, this probably doesn't apply to us, we don't have any DoD contracts. First, we'll talk about, are you sure? But second, even if you don't, it may be something you still want to consider looking at and trying to adopt, because the government is very much in this case switching from our traditional compliance model, as compliance professionals say, trust but verify. So it's not just trusting us like OCR has done thus far, but it's actually requiring that verification. And that's why we believe this could be expanded. So thanks. Tony, you want to go on?
Sure, that was a great point there that you made. And that's exactly why CMMC has come about. Because trusting only was not working, and just look at the news and to where you actually see some weapon systems of our adversaries look just like ours, and it's been proven that those adversaries have actually stolen plans for modern weapon systems under development, and actually reverse engineering, and it came from the DoD contractors. And keep in mind, when we say DoD contractors, it's not just the defense sector. We're going to talk a little bit more about the healthcare sector and how they may be a part of the CMMC ecosystem. So now we're on the slide. How is CMMC aligned to our everyday practice here at Redspin? So at Redspin, we have a methodology that's called resilience validation, and the CMMC fits right into this methodology at Redspin. Resilience validation helps organizations build an approach that responds to everyday practice. So while CMMC is a different compliance and assessment model, our processes align with everyday practices expected to come from the CMMC model. So in other words, that our resilience validation processes fit right into the CMMC, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, how CMMC incorporates processes. So basically, organizations in the industry have primarily focused on the compliance and validation aspects, kind of like the checklist approach. But we take it a step further by ensuring that the organization's security programs are prepared and rehearsed. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how it's important to, when you're preparing for CMMC certification, to prepare and rehearse as well. So this is especially beneficial. This resilience validation methodology that we have is especially beneficial for those preparing for their CMMC certification. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about CMMC and healthcare. We'll look at the role of healthcare when it comes to CMMC certification, and what is the connection there. So hopefully I can help answer those questions about how can healthcare be a part of CMMC? Don't we already have HIPAA compliance that we need to meet? So next slide, please. We'll delve right on in. So as I mentioned, why should healthcare care, as it says on the title, from the redundancy department. So why should healthcare care about CMMC? As I previously mentioned, adversaries are targeting CUI within the entire defense industrial base. Regardless of the industrial sector, such as healthcare, any organization under a DoD contract must understand the requirements within that contract to protect CUI and FCI. Healthcare clients with DoD contracts will likely be required to obtain CMMC certification in the future, possibly in the real near future. Current DoD contracts consisting of healthcare contractors already document the protection of CUI or FCI. However, up until now, it was based on self-attestation. In other words, trust only, but no verification, as Marty stated earlier. So the existing contracts and new contracts will have the clause included to obtain CMMC certification. Also, we're also seeing the DoD CMMC model being extended to other federal agencies, such as the Defense Homeland Security, which you may have seen in the news recently, that they are extending some of their contracts to include CMMC certification requirements. Marty, anything else on this one before I move on?
Yes, and as you think about this, and I go back to my comment earlier about consider looking at the certification model, even if you don't think today you have to comply with it, and particularly if you happen to be near a military base, because while you may not have a contract with DoD to provide healthcare services for that base, a lot of the family members of the military members may be your patients, and that data is going to be targeted by bad actors as well. One of our colleagues, David Finn, has told a story about bad actors trying to access the information of healthcare entities near military bases. And he said, originally I thought, why would they want that data? Why is that important? And one of the things that he learned was, if I'm the spouse of a military member and that military member is being deployed to a certain place in the world, I may need to get certain vaccines, or just the fact that I'm getting boosters or something else along that nature may trigger and start to support and start to narrow down where those troops are being deployed. And if you see a lot of that activity in a short time frame, then again, you might be able to discern it is likely troops are going to be deployed to X place in the world. And so that's going to be important to those nation states and bad actors to be able to think about and be prepared for that. And so again, I just encourage you, take a look at this and think about starting to prepare, because A, we think it's likely other federal agencies are going to add it, like Department of Health and Human Services, and B, it may be something that the bad actors are going to target you even if you don't have that DoD contract or have that CUI. Tony?
Hey, great. That's very good examples. I was in a previous organization where it had to do with, it actually was PHI of animals, where vaccines were tested on animals to get the antibiotics for human beings. And that was definitely PHI that came under the category of CUI, and eventually will require to be CMMC certified. So yeah, this is a great example with respect to healthcare implications. Okay, next slide. We've kind of led into this one. How do I know if I have CUI within my healthcare environment? Marty provided some great examples there with respect to vaccines and troops deployed. But if you look at the guidance, the guidance comes from the National Archives and Records Administration. That agency manages the National CUI Registry that defines CUI, controlled unclassified information, data for various industrial sectors. You can see here that there's a subcategory for healthcare information that is listed under the privacy category. So it's not much of a surprise it's under the privacy category of the CUI registry. So where would this be applicable? I mean, this would be applicable under a DoD contract, possibly, where a contractor may be conducting medical research or in support of clinical trials, or some other examples as Marty illustrated in the previous slide. So is there anything else on there? I think there's genetic information that could be included. So you may be a healthcare organization that's working on some genetic information as well, so you can see where you can fit within the schema of CUI. All right, next slide. I want to mention that there is formal marking guidance when it comes to CUI. I'm mentioning this only because some of you may have been now thinking, well, here's another compliance standard that we got to meet. This can cause an additional burden on contractors handling multiple data sets and compliance requirements such as PII, PHI, CUI. We can go on and on with those three-letter acronyms. And you can also see there's overlaps within each data set. As we just saw in the previous slide, that health information is categorized as CUI. So where are the differences there? We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So much like the concept of privacy within healthcare, CUI is not intended for public release or release to unauthorized entities. Handling CUI requires safeguarding or dissemination controls consistent with the applicable law, regulations, and/or government-wide policies. Now, CMMC falls under some of these laws and regulations and government-wide policies. We won't get into that detail here, but just as with healthcare and HIPAA, under CMMC, you must abide by those applicable laws and regulations. So as you can imagine, this can create an additional burden for healthcare clients as they would need to balance multiple compliance models and regulatory requirements. All right, next slide, please. So why isn't HIPAA compliance good enough? Some of you may be sitting out there thinking, oh, we've been doing all their due diligence. We've been complying with high trust. We incorporated the NIST cybersecurity framework and NIST 800-53. So where does HIPAA fit in? Doesn't HIPAA compliance fit in with CMMC? To a certain extent, any compliance work that a healthcare organization may have done in the past could possibly carry over and support CMMC requirements, but none of those studies have been done yet. This would come under a concept called reciprocity. However, CMMC has specific requirements in order to be certified at level 3, which probably doesn't, I can guarantee, doesn't fall under some of your previous compliance efforts. So the primary difference is that the DoD contractors cannot be awarded contracts without certification. Marty alluded to this earlier in this presentation. So to be able to be awarded a contract, you must already be CMMC level certified, level 3 certified. We're focusing on level 3 here because the multitude of the contracts will more than likely be involving CUI, which really focuses on confidentiality and documented processes. So you can see there's a delta from what you may be used to within your compliance frameworks that you're using now. There is no mandated. So, now the difference here when it comes to HIPAA, that there is no mandated certification program for HIPAA like there is for CMMC. So for DoD contracts that require CMMC certification, the healthcare contractor must be certified before contract of that award. Did I leave anything out there, Marty, or was that clear?
No, I don't think you left anything out, but one of the things I'd just like to add to your comments is that, when you think about this, and Tony mentioned it earlier, a lot of the risk assessments that are performed with interview processes and not a lot of actual validation. Does this work? Is it operating as expected? And Tony, correct me if I misstate this, but I think when you become CMMC certified, you're going to have to be prepared to validate that your process works. It's not going to be enough just to have someone interview you and say, yes, we have the policies and procedures, and maybe review those policies and procedures, but really validate the practices. And that's the model, as Tony pointed out, that Redspin uses and that we're recommending is you need to have that process of validation and you need to exercise it. And Tony mentioned in the prior slide, this needs to become a little bit of muscle memory. And we're going to talk more about that as we go through the synergistic experience of actually becoming certified. Tony?
No, you're exactly right, Marty. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on what we call that the part of CMMC is measuring your proficiency to conduct or execute your tasks. So we're going to touch on that very shortly. Next slide, please. So Marty kind of mentioned it here. We're going to talk about Redspin's experience and the lessons learned from our own CMMC Level 3 assessment. To be a CMMC third-party assessment organization, we were required to be CMMC Level 3 certified ourselves. So we went through that experience. So we are also, what is that, Hair Club for Men? We're not only the owner, but we're a member, right? So, we've been through the process, makes us very unique. We were the first authorized C3PO to go through this process and pass. And so we understand the process from being an assessee, so to speak. So what I'll do is I'll relate our experience with respect to how healthcare may be impacted as we go through our lessons learned from the CMMC assessment. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to describe the CMMC model at a 50,000-foot level. So it's a very high level. It's not going to get into a lot of details, but I want to explain what CMMC brings that's a little bit different from the security frameworks you may have been involved with previously. And Marty touched on this a bit as well. So what sets CMMC apart from other compliance models is that it incorporates both the practices. Think about traditional security controls. CMMC calls those practices and processes. So basically it incorporates both practices and processes. Think of processes as the policies, the procedures, the plans to ensure that the CMMC requirements are disciplined, repeatable, and lasting. And so going with that fact is disciplined, repeatable, and lasting. Marty brought that up with respect to you need to prove that your processes are disciplined, repeatable, and lasting. I've been saying that over and over again because that's a very important part that sets CMMC, apart from the other frameworks. So this chart shows the progression of those practices or security controls. You can see the rigor of the practices increases as the maturity level increases. Note that the practices are cumulative, meaning that for CMMC Level 3 certification, the contractor must meet all requirements for levels 1, 2, and 3. So you'll see on the chart that the 130 practices for level 3, that includes the practices for levels 1 and 2. So you need to keep that in mind, that it's cumulative there, and the rigor increases as the maturity level increases. Next slide, please. So now we'll turn to the processes. As you recall, CMMC incorporates practices and processes. So this chart shows the progression of processes. Once again, just as with practices, the processes are cumulative, meaning that for level 3, the contractor must meet all requirements for levels 1, 2, and 3. Basically, the intent of the processes is to demonstrate maturity of your cybersecurity program as it relates to meeting the CMMC requirements. Institutionalizing processes takes time, and in many cases, the organization's culture may be a hurdle in receiving certification. This is something, as I've been doing some CMMC consulting, that I've been seeing from some of those clients, that they have a hard time overcoming that hurdle with respect to the organization's culture. And some of you may experience this as well, because I think this is prevalent through many organizations. If it has to do with security, cybersecurity, then it must be the IT folks. It must be the security folks. You know, they're the ones responsible for taking care of this. Well, CMMC takes a different approach to this. It requires institutionalization, which means that all your key stakeholders are actively involved, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So CMMC has the word maturity in it. Maturity is based on the concept of institutionalization. Remember what I said about institutionalization. It's ensuring that all key stakeholders, non-IT, non-security, are involved, and that they can show that the outcomes are consistent, disciplined, repeatable, and they meet all the standards of CMMC. Next slide, please. I know that was a mouthful, but as I stated, I've been working CMMC for about 18 months now. And from my experiences working within the CMMC ecosystem, achieving CMMC certification will require some level of change in the organizational culture. The CMMC model, and I repeat, is not an exclusive IT or cybersecurity team endeavor. So based on, as I mentioned, with my working with some clients, currently working with some clients, our first few meetings to talk about how do they prepare for CMMC, what is an SSP, how do I start developing policies. The attendance was mostly IT, the security folks. So how could I talk about personnel security policy without the HR personnel involved? So I had to straighten out that culture, or try to, in the early stages of our consulting engagement. So basically, the organization must demonstrate the maturity with respect to its policies, processes, and procedures that are consistent, repeatable, and lasting. I keep saying that. Consistent, disciplined, repeatable, and lasting. This is a prevalent theme throughout the CMMC model and throughout your assessment. So the bottom line, and once again, from my experiences, culture change will be required for some organizations. You need to overcome that hurdle before you can go any further into becoming CMMC certified. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about these practices and processes. This graphic, which some of you may have seen, I know some of you on the poll stated that you're well prepared or you're getting there, so you more than likely have seen this chart. It's important for the contractor who's seeking certification to ensure that the CUI and FCI is protected accordingly. So if you see on this chart that FCI, you really only need to be level 1 certified. There's only 2 certifications in CMMC as of right now. You're either level 1 certified or level 3 certified. Level 2 is kind of a stepping stone from level 1 to get to level 3. So keep that in mind. Level 5 is not defined yet, completely implemented, but it will be. And then there will be 3 levels of certification. So as you can see from the diagram, protecting FCI, and FCI can come under those services, and I believe Marty brought up one of those examples that could be FCI. It's all about contractual information that if you knew how much of that vaccine was going to what location, that needs to be protected. And typically that's FCI, which is federal contract information. Depending on the contract and the way they define it, you could be responsible for protecting FCI and CUI. And you see here, CMMC level 3 requires more rigor, in which we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, but that's where you start getting into those practices and policies and procedures, where if you look at FCI, it's really 17 practices or security controls and doesn't require documentation or policies or procedures. So keep that in mind. And some clients that I've talked to, they have the understanding or misunderstanding that you can choose level 1 or 3. You cannot choose level 1 or 3. It's based on the sensitivity of the data you're protecting, and the contract should be spelling that out as what levels of certification you will need. Next slide, please. So as how do we prepare for our CMMC level 3 assessment to be certified? Redspin took the following approach. It was pretty much a five-step approach. Once again, it's high level. First, we ensured that we understood the protection requirements for CUI. We clearly identified where our CUI lived, died, and breathed. Keep in mind that you need to know where that CUI data is. If you don't, then you're going to have to protect your entire organization, which, as you know, is not practical, not affordable to protect your entire organization at that level. So know where your data, your CUI data is, because it's going to have to come under the requirements of CMMC. Second, we identified the key stakeholders with respect to protecting CUI.
So, Tony, sorry, but before you move on,
Sure.
can just a couple of questions or thoughts around the understanding the data.
Sure.
If you're a healthcare entity and you've done research, there might have been criteria in some of the grants you've gotten that have required that you attest or somehow confirm that you're FDA Part 11 compliant. And this is really kind of analogous to what Tony was saying in understanding where your data lives, because a lot of organizations didn't want to become FDA Part 11 compliant across the entire organization, but they wanted to try and segregate that specific data in systems that would be Part 11 compliant. And so, that's really, I think, an important analogy to consider and think about, because that's really what Tony's saying, and understanding where your CUI is. I think a lot of practices, and Tony, tell me if you disagree with this, but I think a lot of your practices are going to be applicable across the organization anyway, because they're just good cybersecurity practices. But there may be additional requirements under CMMC that you may choose not to apply to the entire organization, but that is really it's going to be critical that you know where that data is and understand where it is, because you don't want it in a system that doesn't meet the criteria.
No, that's exactly right. And you're going to need to know what data is that is a part of that contract, and that contract is going to specify how that data will be protected, and it's going to specify CMMC level 1 or level 3, and you need to protect that segmented data appropriately. And as you said, now there's going to be some enterprise policies and processes that come into play. And we typically call those inherited controls, and some of you who've done other frameworks, that's not unfamiliar to you. So that's a very good point. That data, if you know where it lives, and maybe it lives way off outside your organization somewhere, and I'm not just talking physically, but I'm talking organizationally, then you go ahead and really isolate that. We'll talk about isolation a little bit later. The second thing we did is we identified those key stakeholders. With respect to protecting CUI. Okay, we know where the data is now. Who's handling that data, and ensure that they have the proper mechanisms in place to protect that data. And when I'm saying mechanisms, I'm talking about policies and procedures and the technical controls. So you can see the key stakeholders could be your managers, your operators, as well as your IT technicians. Third, we identified the scope of the assessment, and that's what we talked about in the first bullet there with the data is, isolate that, scope your environment. You will, and one of the requirements of CMMC is ensuring that you scope the environment and you describe that scope within your system security plan. So what you need to do is, this is the only place where this CUI data for this contract lives. And these are the folks who will access this data within this secured enclave. So we had to do that, and for our organization, it was relatively easy. We identified 10 individuals who would be processing, storing, and transmitting CUI. So that, and we call that ground zero. So we developed a secure enclave that was ground zero, and that's the only place where that CUI was processed, stored, and transmitted from or to. So we clearly identified that scope. The rest of the synergistic and Redspin employees were out of scope. There was no way they can touch that data, or that data could get to them. So that's what we're talking about when when we talk about scoping your organization for the assessment. Fourth is, now that you scoped it out, what is this thing called objective evidence? We had to understand the objective evidence, and it's a CMMC term. So within the realm of CMMC objective evidence, those are the artifacts that prove that the practices and the processes have been implemented. This is nothing really out in the ordinary. If you're familiar with other compliance frameworks, some examples are policies, your procedures, records, visitor log records, things like that, screenshots, just to name a few. So you need to have those ready and be sure that they are actually tied back to meeting those requirements. It's very important to have that for your CMMC assessment. And finally, we ensured that we understood the evaluation criteria for each practice and process. As mentioned earlier, CMMC is more than just a checklist approach that documents implementation of security controls. For example, if some of you may be familiar with NIST SP 800-171, which is this catalog of security controls to protect CUI. Most organizations in the self-attestation we talked about, is they went down all 110 security controls and checked off if they're implemented or not, and it stopped there. So it never had any kind of maturity to it to where you could prove that you're proactively managing that CMMC program that's protecting that CUI data. All right, now next slide, please.
Sorry, Tony, but just again, before you move on, I want to comment, when you think about this, there's been a lot of discussion in the privacy realm in particular about data governance and good data mapping, and it ties into everything we said on the previous slide. But again, thinking about, there's no requirement under HIPAA that you have data mapping. There is some criteria under GDPR, if that's applicable to you. Arguably, under some of the new state privacy laws, there might be, although it's not explicitly required, a need to data map for this purpose. And again, this ties back into your general compliance program and some of the things you might be already doing or consider doing, and thinking about that good data governance, because if you have this data, as Tony pointed out, Synergistic has created that secure enclave. I'm not one of the people that can access CUI data. I don't know anything about the enclave. I shouldn't know anything about the enclave. And that should be clearly understood by all of your folks who grant access, who set up security processes, that, Marty's role is not such that she should have access to this particular space within our network or within our realm. But it's also really going back to training people on things like, don't let someone piggyback into that secure area. You see the UPS guy carrying the box, or woman carrying the box in, and you want to be helpful and be courteous, so you hold the door open for them. And then that person's really someone who's there to steal a device, steal a badge, steal something. And so, again, it's really important that you think about that. And as Tony's pointed out so far, and will continue, being required to validate how you ensure that happens, and really empowering employees to say no. Saying, if that UPS person comes up and says, "Oh, can you help me out?" Help, having them understand, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go sign in at wherever and leave the package there. I can't let you into this area. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, excellent example. Okay, now we'll shift a little bit into what were the lessons learned from our assessment. There are four major areas we'll cover here. First is corralling your CUI. The second is practice and process readiness. And we've talked about practices and processes. The third is coaching a team, a very interesting concept that was very helpful for us. And the fourth is ongoing cyber hygiene, which really says, hey, once you get your certification, you're not done. And these lessons learned follow closely to our compliance strategy that I covered earlier, if you remember our compliance strategy. So let me go into corralling your CUI. This involves understanding where your data lives and designing your environment to ensure that CUI is isolated from the rest of the business environment. This should sound familiar because these are the first two bullets in the previous slide that we talked about. So defining the boundaries, as I mentioned earlier, it's called scoping within the CMMC vernacular, is critical to ensure that the data is isolated from the rest of the business environment. And Marty provided a great example of that in the previous slide. Also, each stakeholder must understand where the CUI resides and how to handle and mark that data. We cannot forget about the handling of that data. Marty made a great example about she should have no business accessing CUI. But what we did in Synergistic Redspin was we had every employee go through CUI handling and marking training. Well, why is that? Why did Marty go through CUI training and she's not going to have anything to do with it? Well, she needs to understand if she detects possible CUI outside of that environment for whatever reason, the UPS man drops something, it looks like it's CUI. She needs to understand what to do if she does discover that. And then she needs to know where to report it to. And then that kicks off the whole incident response chain there. So it's important for all the employees in the organization to have awareness of what CUI is. It's not unlike like in a DoD, if anyone there military vets or active duty today, is if you have a secret clearance but you don't have a top secret clearance, you are trained to know when you see a top secret cover sheet somewhere where and you know it shouldn't be there, then you need to report that. So same concept applies here. All right, next slide, please. So as I kept saying here, this is more than a compliance checklist approach. The CMMC model brings with it the nuance of the disciplined, repeatable, lasting processes. Yes, I sound like your mom, right? Saying this over and over again, but this is the key to the CMMC model here. Which means your organization must ensure that it's ready, and this comes through practice and rehearsal. So to meet this objective, stakeholders must ensure that the foundation of policies, processes, procedures, and plans are in place. Not only are they in place, but you must exercise them, practice them, rehearse them. So don't overlook the process-based or managerial-focused security domains, such as risk management and risk incident response. Those are relatively process-based, as well as personnel security. They require stakeholder involvement from across the organization. They must be able to clearly communicate with each other and tell the story of its risk management processes or its incident response processes, as an example. Be ready to tell your story. Marty mentioned this earlier on, is you've got to exhibit proficiency in execution of your tasks. So for example, let's use incident response, security family. It requires cross-functional stakeholders. It's not just your cybersecurity folks, it's not your IT folks. Each individual who's a part of that incident response process must understand their role within that overall process. And during the assessment, all those individuals will more than likely be interviewed in detail on their part of that process. And keep in mind that, once again, Marty and I are saying this over and over, it's not just your IT folks, your security folks, it's your PR, your HR, your chief clinical officers, general counsel, legal, marketing. The list can go on. I'm sure Marty can add a bunch of others to this list as well. You can see that it requires a lot of folks involved in the CMMC compliance.
Yeah, and Tony, when you think about incident response here, you also, I think, have to consider the idea that even under some of your current contracts with the government, you may have obligations to notify promptly of any sort of data compromise or security breach. And, under CMMC, that's probably going to become even more important. So being cognizant that as you exercise your incident response, maybe even in your current practices, you have to think about who has to be notified and when. And when we see incident response exercises occurring, people tend to think the HIPAA timeline, but you may have shorter timelines under state breach notification laws, and even much, much shorter timelines if you do have this kind of DoD contract. So as you do incident response, we advocate very strongly that it involves all the stakeholders and not just your IT team. And I think as you consider doing this type of thing with CMMC, that's going to become even more important.
Yes, agreed. Very, very good points. In talking from an assessment readiness perspective, you must be ready for this assessment, and to be ready is to ensure that you have all your documentation completed. I mean, that's all your procedures, all your processes, policies must be documented with appropriate roles and responsibilities. This is another key element of the assessment, is ensuring that you have well-defined roles and responsibilities. And I recommend using what we used, is something called a responsibility traceability matrix, which listed every CMMC practice and every CMMC process and had names, roles applied to it, and the names applied to it. So the assessor knew who to interview and who to contact during the assessment. Also, at maturity level 3, and Marty mentioned this, the stakeholders, and which CMMC calls the SMEs, right? Subject matter experts, are expected to show proficiency with respect to their tasks. So what this means, some of your ears may perk up, is yes, it does require live demonstrations and tests. So the assessor will take the firewall manager, ask the firewall manager to log in to the URL and show the assessor how to configure certain settings and things like that. So a lot of that does happen during the assessment. All right, next slide, please. The third one is coaching your team. And speaking of incident response, it's one thing that we did here at Redspin, and I'll say synergistic because, as I mentioned, folks at the synergistic level also was actively involved in this, because there were some enterprise functions that was also a part of the CMMC requirements. So we went through a few IR exercises together with all those stakeholders that you saw, except for the chief medical officer, for the healthcare stakeholders. We found it was a great avenue to get the cross-functional players involved and talking to each other and coaching each other. And really, and we did this not as the standard IR tabletop exercise, but actually to go through to ensure that we knew our story when the assessor asked us, that we could put on a good show, so to speak. And that's what you want to do. And that's why I mentioned rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. You want to put on a good show. Sometimes you get rusty in some of your tasks because you don't use them very often. How often in your organization has your incident response team really stood up to the highest level and had to incorporate and activate all your incident response team members? Not very often. But for the assessment, you do have to show proficiency in those unlikely cases. So keep that in mind. So one thing that we learned from our CMMC Level 3 assessment is to ensure that we are coaching all key stakeholders or subject matter experts to prepare for the assessment. So what we did 3 to 4 weeks before our scheduled assessments, we coached each other. We went through each domain, had the key stakeholders from each domain, and we would just Zoom each other, get us on there and just talk about scenarios. I would develop scenarios and we would talk through them. So, and it was an eye-opening experience, and we covered some gaps that we didn't realize we had. So it truly did. It helped us better secure some of our policies, processes, and procedures. And this also secured the fact that these SMEs are not just the IT and cybersecurity folks. They're from across the organization. And they need to understand how to tell their story and show proficiency in all their tasks with respect to their part in protecting CUI or FCI. So the point here is our HR department, they know their job inside and out, but along comes this new CMMC requirement. So what does that mean for the HR department? Well, they had to put those CMMC hooks into their current solid, personnel security and human resources processes. So, you got your recruiting, you got your retainment. For CMMC processes, our HR department had to prove and had to exhibit how they ensured that the key personnel who are handling, processing, storing CUI data, what is the continuity there if any one of those key stakeholders happens just to depart the company suddenly? What is the plan for picking back up? And so you can continue protecting CUI at the appropriate level. So it gets into that type of detail. And so you're going to find that your human resource department has a lot more involvement in CMMC, more so than it does in any other security framework. All right, next slide, please.
Yeah, and Tony, just a quick comment on that. If you're currently doing IR exercises, but you're only involving the IT team or maybe the IT team and the compliance team, and you're not involving those senior leaders, as we always recommend that you do, and that now you're going to have to get ready for CMMC, I think that's going to be another area where it's going to be new to them. If you've been doing it all along, this really isn't going to be that much of a change. It might be learning a few new processes and practices that fall under CMMC, but if they've already been well coached and prepared and do incident response on a regular basis, it's going to make it just that much easier. If they haven't been, you might need to do more of that coaching than other organizations will.
Very good point. And you mentioned, if we're already strong in certain areas, it's all about, just making sure that you're what I call putting in those CMMC hooks. For example, if your organization already has a strong IT governance structure, however you define that, and when we talk about IT governance structure, you got your strategic plan in place, right? You got your organization strategic plan, IT strategic plan, you got a cybersecurity strategic plan, you got a configuration control board, you might have an investment board or architecture board. If that's already in place, all you need to do is put the CMMC hooks into that. And a good example that we did is when we were being assessed, we used the example that we did not have a really formal SIM, SIEM, some of you call it SIEM. So we went through our IT governance process and to define the requirement of what we needed to meet the CMMC requirement for centralized repository, in auditing and logging. So we went through and we took the assessors through. We told our story. Here's a good example. We needed a SIM, and here's our requirements, and here's a couple of products, and we walked them through how we narrowed it down to one product that fit the need of not only the organization but for CMMC, and how we implemented that. And it was implemented, and it was in operation in time for our assessment. So the assessors liked that example, and as I said, talk your story, understand your story, and that passed a very difficult process requirement for that. It's in CMMC called resource a plan. So that's one example here. Now on this slide this is a CMMC assessment guide, and I'll talk this, I think it's on the next slide. Become very familiar with this, but the point I want to make here, you see this is the table of contents, and it happens to have personnel security and physical security domains on it. This is from the CMMC assessment guide for level 3. It shows that achieving CMMC certifications, not just an IT endeavor. As you can see here, you got many different folks here. You got the facility manager down in the physical security domain, personnel security domain. Of course, you got HR. You got CFO involved because, as I mentioned, one of the major process requirements is the resource a plan. So the CFO is involved in every one of these security domains because the assessors are going to look at and ensure that you have a plan, a resourced plan to ensure that every domain is meeting CMMC requirements and continues to meet those requirements. All right, next slide, please. And so that leads me to the final lessons learned. And as I said, ensure that you're continually meeting those requirements. You've got to do this continuously. This is not a one and done. Yes, we got a certification. We're good to go for another 3 years. Well, as you know, let's go back to the top of this presentation. Threats change. Threats get smarter, which means you may be changing some of your architecture. You need to keep up with your CMMC certification. You don't want to wait until that 3-year point and hope you pass the certification again because you passed it the first time. Well, things have changed in 3 years. So keep in mind, the CMMC model is not designed to be one and done. You must maintain all your policies and procedures. So what I like to say is about this is it requires a culture shift, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that the cyber hygiene is threaded throughout the fabric of your organization. This means that if you remove a thread, the fabric will come undone. So everyone still needs to be involved. This does not mean, oh, we got a certification. Okay, IT and cybersecurity folks, you maintain it. No, every key stakeholder within your CMMC ecosystem there must maintain ongoing cyber hygiene throughout your certification.
And I just want to do a very quick announcement. We are wrapping up. We just have a couple more slides to go through, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So if you're thinking about when's that going to happen, it's going to be happening in just a few more minutes. Just
a few minutes. So what I want to really leave you with is 2 more slides. Next slide, please. 2 more slides on, how should you prepare for an upcoming assessment. So for some of you who said you're well prepared or getting there, here's our recommendation based on what we experienced through our assessment. You want to conduct an internal self-assessment. You want to hire an independent consultant to conduct that an objective assessment, and you want to remediate those gaps. So here, what you see is for the first one is you need to conduct your internal self-assessment. Some of you may already have, because if you were following one of the federal regulations, you were already conducting your self-assessment. Remember, we talked about trust. So you should have already done that, and you can see it there. Make sure you know where your resources are, who the stakeholders are, where your data. All this we've already talked about before. That always plays. Next slide, please. So once you've done that, recommend hiring an independent consultant. We actually did this a few weeks before our scheduled assessments. The independent consultant can help you with that objectivity and experience, and as well as can see the forest through the trees. Right, you're missing some things because you're so close to it for so long. So really, they can really help validate your self-assessment that you've done and really identify those gaps. And once you have those gaps identified, and now it's time to close those gaps. This can be done, internally, or you can have an independent consultant, to come in and help you with remediation. But keep in mind that you should plan ahead for this remediation, especially for level 3, because it may require some re-architecting, redesigning your network to actually, to segment your into a secure enclave, for example. So keep that in mind. So 3 major things: do your internal self-assessment, hire an independent consultant to ensure that you actually didn't overlook anything, and then you actually remediate, because you're not going to be perfect the first time out. Next slide, please. I recommend these playbooks. I talked about these. I showed some of these. These will help you prepare for your assessment. Also, the CMMC assessors use these same playbooks. So they will be using the CMMC assessment guide all the way there to the right, and they'll be using NIST SP 800-171 Alpha. You see there in the middle, that alpha means for assessment. So that's there. It really provides the assessment guidance. How do you assess implementation of your security controls? So keep those in mind, get them handy, become very familiar with them. And those folks who says they're getting there and they're well prepared, I'm sure they know these 3 playbooks inside and out by now. So as Marty stated, we're ready to wrap up. We reached the end of our presentation. So in summary, CMMC is here to stay in some form or fashion. It will gradually develop and improve over time, but it's here. It's time based on those threats we talked about over an hour ago now. CMMC is currently for DoD contractors, but it will likely expand to other agencies. organizations need to prepare and will take time, and follow these recommendations covered in this presentation. And remember, document, 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 exercise, 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 rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Very important that you do this before the actual time for assessment. And with that, I think we're ready to go to the next slide for our fourth poll question. And let me lose Marty there. Are we ready for the fourth poll question?
Sorry, yes, I muted myself. So I was speaking, but nobody heard me.
Okay, there we go. No one else has ever done that before.
So we just want to get a sense of how you feel about the assessment, and whether you now think, yes, you probably will need to be CMMC certified now that you've spent the last hour with us discussing this. So again, to launch the poll, click the poll tab on the left-hand side, select poll number 4, and click vote now. And tell us, yes, you think you will, no, you don't think you will now, and or you're still not sure, you still don't know. And as we see those responses coming in, I think we have a few more people who are now saying they don't think they will need to be than what said that at the beginning. And more people, I think, are saying yes, they will have to be. We still have a fair number of people who aren't quite sure. And I don't think that's surprising. I think, understanding what contracts you have, understanding what data you're getting is going to take some time to evaluate. And that's part of why we wanted to share this with you this afternoon, is to get you started thinking about it, and maybe doing a little bit more research within your organization and thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to figure out, do I need this, and do I need to be ready for it? Because if you do, as Tony pointed out, we hired an independent assessor to look at us as we were getting ready, and we think that's going to be extremely helpful to you. Obviously, we have a vested interest, because this is definitely a service we can offer and support you with. But it is something that I think is having that other party come in and take a look under the rug. As many of you probably have done internal incident response exercises, I think if you've had an external party come in and do an exercise with you, it's very rare that I go into clients that they don't identify something that they need to change or add to or didn't think about by doing it internally. And so that's something to think about and consider. So our it looks like we've got a fair number of votes in already. It's about 20% yes, 30% no, and about 50% of you still aren't sure, still don't know. So Tony, with that, I think we're ready for the Q&A. So Carrie, do you want to tell folks how to ask questions?
Sure, and thank you both for such an informative session. And as the VP of Marketing, I will tell you that I was very involved in the CMMC process, and had to do, we were doing most of the procedures and processes, but one of the things, my takeaway was that we weren't doing a lot of logging. And so that was very informative for our team. So, now we'll move into the collaborative breakout session, where we've come up with some topics that we thought would drive some interesting conversation, or we also encourage you to ask questions or pose another topic. And to participate in the conversation, you can unmute yourself and then turn on your camera. That helps us know that you would like to ask a question or participate in the conversation. So if we can go to the next slide, we do have some questions or topics there, but before we get there, I just wanted to open it up and see if anyone has any questions now. And also, if you don't feel comfortable going on camera, or you prefer, you can also just ask the question in the Q&A button and tab, and I will come on, or Marty or somebody will respond to that question.
Now, we had 50% of you who said you didn't know or still weren't sure. So that tells me there may be some questions in the audience. So, feel free to ask them.
We do have a question that came in. Thoughts on overlap between CTEK HIPAA style risk assessment and that of a lower level CMMC assessment?
Okay, so if I heard that right, they're asking about how much overlap is there between the synergistic healthcare, is it the risk assessment? Did I catch that right?
Yeah, they're saying the HIPAA style risk assessment.
Yeah, there could be some overlap, but that's going to go back to the scoping that I talked about, meaning what you're going to scope within your CMMC assessment is only on that CUI data that comes under that contract. So it's going to spell that out. So if you're doing any medical research, so that research data will come under that CMMC umbrella. Now, if part of that RA covered that research environment, then that's where some of the overlap may occur. Now, keep in mind that these assessments are kind of snapshot in time, so we would still have to reassess those, what you've already done. This is where the consulting really comes into play. So when you have a consultant, they're going to help you navigate through that with respect to how much overlap is there, and does that carry over directly into the CMMC framework, to meet the requirements, or do we have to do some modification? So really the answer is depends, and that's not a cop-out here, but we would look at that, and a consultant would look at that. I recommend, the consultant, especially if you've already done a synergistic one, go back to them and ask, okay, we've done this RA for healthcare. How much of this would apply to the CMMC environment based on this contract for this research data? Because as you know, some of you have done our risk assessments and synergistic. Many times you've done the entire environment. Sometimes you've actually scoped it down to medical devices or the entire organization. So it's all going to depend on that. But we will look for those overlaps and see what we need to do to bring those up to CMMC standards.
Yeah, and Tony, I think one other difference is that with our risk assessment process, we don't tend to do the validation that we do in our resilience validation service. And I think that's one difference between getting the CMMC certification and our standard risk assessment process. You're going to see that validation step that is really mandatory under CMMC that you might not be currently getting done under your HIPAA program.
Right.
And we actually have another question. What formal training on CMMC is available and from whom?
That's a good question. You may have seen on social media, especially LinkedIn, there's some informal training, which is fine. It's going to be basically a lot of your 101 CMMC basics, kind of what I covered here in this briefing, this presentation. The formal training, it truly is formal. The DoD has to approve the curriculum. And that curriculum for I think I mentioned it earlier, is the Certified CMMC Professional, also known as CCP. The DoD loves their acronyms. That's a formal training. The curriculum and exam is approved through the DoD. It comes through the CMMC accreditation body. As I said, the courses will be available come November, which means you'll take a week-long course. And at the end of the course, you have, I think, up to 30 days to take the exam. Then you will become a certified CMMC professional. Now, what does CCP mean? It's really for, I actually was on the working group that developed the curriculum for the CCP, as well as I'm also actually currently right now writing the exam questions for the CCP. So I'm very familiar with this program. So it's for three major groups. two of the groups is part of your OSC, Organization Seeking Certification, DoD contractors, right? You will want to have, many organizations will want to have these professionals, CCP, within their organizations to help navigate the organization through CMMC requirements, getting them ready to be certified. Once you get certified, these CCPs within your organization will also help maintain the certification. The other group under your OSE is your executive level. They're working a plan to where this is good for your CFO. We mentioned CFO a lot throughout this presentation, didn't we? Your CFO can go through it. Your CIO, CISO can go through it as well and become CCP certified. The other one is on the assessor side. To be an assessor, you need to go through the CCP formal training and get your CCP badge, and then eventually your certified assessor badge. So hopefully that answers your question. You can find these on the CMMC marketplace. There, who the licensed training providers are, and as I mentioned earlier, Redspin is a licensed training provider, and we were preparing right now to start launching the first CCP training course first or second week of November, assuming it's all available. That we're all waiting on the DoD for that.
So Tony, I don't see any more questions in the chat. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question on camera, please turn your camera on, and that way we'll know. So we'll wait just another moment, but I have another question if we don't get any from the audience.
There is one from the audience. If a healthcare provider accepts TRICARE patients, is there a CMMC requirement?
Was this to do with TRICARE?
TRICARE, correct.
Yes. If there's a company under DoD contract, and if I recall, TRICARE is contracted out. So whoever is on that contract, or if the contract's being rebid, I don't know what the cycle is right now, contract cycle. Anyone bidding on the contract renewal must be CMMC, more than likely level 3, because we're talking health information, and as you recall, the CUI registry includes health information. That contract, the TRICARE contract, should specify that you will meet be compliant with the DFARS 7021 clause. 7021 clause is you will be CMMC level 3 compliant. So for rebid, if it's renewed, that verbiage should be in that contract. And so whether you're the incumbent or you're a bidder on that contract, you will need to be level 3 certified by contract award. Now the current contracts are grandfathered so far. I mean that's the policy that I know. So if TRICARE still has another 2 to 3, 4 years on it, what we're being told is that CMMC clause will be in the new contract to be bid.
Tony, I think the question is if a healthcare provider accepts TRICARE patients.
Oh yeah. Okay. I see. So yeah, I answered the easy question. I didn't want to answer the hard one. So if they receive TRICARE patients, that's a very good question, because now that brings almost the entire healthcare sector into play. That's a very good question. If they receive healthcare information, keep in mind that depending on if that contract, TRICARE contract, does specify that you need to be CMMC level 3 compliant, it means that that data needs to be protected at that level. Now, I don't know if the TRICARE contract would have that clause, CMMC clause, in there, because it's not directly related to any kind of military weapon systems or things like that, or research. So that's a question I can't answer at this time, but I can look into what are the ramifications for those kind of, I'll use the Dr. Evil subcontractors, so to speak, right? You're kind of subcontract, not actually formal contract. If you're receiving health information from TRICARE, and if they do have a CMMC, you know, that's 7021 calls in there, what is the impact for those providers that's receiving or exchanging that data? So it all comes down to, now keep in mind, the contract should specify what health information it comes under that contract. They may specify, well, this information, patient information, doesn't come under CMMC. There may be some other subset of information that's included. So hopefully it's not, you know, the entire PHI.
Yeah, and Tony, I would think one of the things you may want to do is look at your participating provider agreements with TRICARE today, and see what they say about the data that's collected about the military member, the military family member, more likely, but see, you know, what do they say about that data today, and that might give you some insight into whether a renewal of that participating agreement will require you to be CMMC certified. Because again, it is generally, if you're participating a contractual relationship, but you're not really a subcontractor under the DoD agreement that the TRICARE plan that is administering the plan may have. So that's one of the places I would start to look, because that's a great question and I don't know the answer either. But I would think if you look today and see what criteria they have in protecting the information, if any, then that might lend some insight into whether you are likely to see that in the future. And then, as Tony mentioned, we'll do a little more digging on that and see if we can get you a more concrete answer.
And at this time, we don't have any additional questions. So in the audience, if you'd like to, you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera to ask any other questions.
So Tony, I think one of the questions that might be helpful is you talked about the process and talked about preparing for it and talked about going through it and you know, shared kind of how arduous it was for Synergistic to do, Redspin to do technically. So what happens if you're missing something that's deemed required by the assessor? How can you help ensure that doesn't happen? And what happens if you do find that you're missing something?
That's a good question, and I'm glad that was up here because we get this all the time. Many of you who have been following CMMC, you hear all the time that it's all or nothing. There is no POAM that comes out of your assessment. You have to pass all 130 practices and all the associated processes. You cannot have any with a finding. So what does that mean? Do I have to be perfect? You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to meet all those requirements. Now, what happens if you're missing something? That's where the assessment team is going to look at, well, how serious is it? So from our experience, once again, we're not perfect. So we have some of our procedures was just missing some information, but not critical information. So the assessor allowed us to fix that overnight. They couldn't recommend what we had to fix. They would tell us what's wrong. You're missing some of your roles and responsibilities. And we kind of knew because we went back, well, oh yeah, we missed that. So we fixed that, and overnight we were able to upload it to the central repository. They looked at it and they passed the control. That's the easy one. That's common sense. I mean, we got hit on our system security plan. The table of contents was, the pages didn't match in table of contents to the document. Well, that was a simple fix. You're thinking, well, man, that's so petty. Well, okay. And we actually fixed that. You just update your table of contents. It's a Microsoft Word issue. So those minor things, they let you fix. Some of the other things, like we didn't have the job descriptions. And going back to personnel security, they wanted to see our job descriptions of the key personnel and ensure they had CMMC hooks in it. Like we updated ours to include that this person should have CCP training that we talked about. And they went ahead and let that go. So in fact, the CMMC assessment process does have that hook in there for any minor discrepancies that could be, considered spot fixes. You can do that. Now there's a remediation portion, which means if it can't be fixed overnight, quickly spot fix, but it can be fixed within 90 days, then we'll keep the assessment open. The assessment team will keep the assessment open. You have 90 days to fix those things. And typically, maybe you'll come back 2 weeks later, assessment team will look at it, okay, you passed. Then they'll close out the assessment. Congratulations, you achieved CMMC Level 3 certification. Now, if you have something major, really major, it's going to take 6 months to fix it. Hopefully, you're not at that point. Then that means you did not pass your CMMC Level 3 certification. You will be annotated in the system called SPRS, where someone may have uploaded that. It's either there, I don't know if they finalized, but because that's where your score is, your SPRS score. It's another issue. We won't get into that. But your level of CMMC certification will be annotated there. So you didn't meet level 3, so what level are you? Depending upon the remainder of the controls, you're going to be either level 1 or level 2. That's where the level 2 comes in. So you will be within that database as a level 2, and we have a plan. Now you've got the POAM. You're going to come back 6 months later and show us that you truly did implement that SIM, as an example. So that's how it works. It's really 3 levels: spot fixes, the remediation, which means you can fix it within 90 days, but more than likely, hopefully it's something you fix a week or 2 later. The assessment's still open, and we just wait for you to come back with the remediation. That third one is something major. We close the assessment. You are not level 3 certified. You're either level 1 or level 2, and you're going to come back. And it may not be the same assessment team. It may be another C3PAO still working those details out. And you would come back and do what's called a Delta assessment.
And so, Tony, thinking about that and just reiterating, that means if you're waiting to get a contract, if you need to be CMMC certified to get the contract, and you're not going to be able to get that for 6 months, there may be a high likelihood that you're going to lose that contract. So thinking about that.
Exactly. And that's why I think earlier I mentioned, make sure you back up from when you expect that's going to be and your assessment's going to be, and do the proper preparation. It takes time. I know the CMMC AB, they always say it can take you between 6 and 12 months to prepare for your level 3 certification.
And something else I'd thought about that I didn't come up with during our discussion in preparing for this, but we've talked about healthcare, but I also want to think about and consider research, because if you're in an institution, a higher ed institution, you may very well be doing research with DoD under DoD contracts that's unrelated to healthcare issues, but still may require the protection of CUI under the CMMC. And I point that out because I've have a fair amount of experience in institutions of higher ed. And in my experience, the researcher may sign something under the grant that says they will be as they submit for the grant, and they'll say they meet certain criteria without fully understanding what that criteria is, and they're going to have to be able to prove it. So thinking through where those agreements are and making sure that's part of your process as well, that if you have anything going on that you think might require CMMC certification, all those stakeholders, as Tony pointed out, understand what that criteria is, and they're not just blindly signing something saying, yes, we can meet that criteria, and then you uncover at some other point that in fact you aren't certified and don't meet the criteria, or the environment that person works in doesn't fall under your original CMMC certification. Tony, I don't know if you went on mute, but I don't hear you in the background.
Yeah, I was reading if you had any more questions. I don't see any more questions out there. That's what I was reviewing here.
Marty and Tony, if there's not anything else you guys want to go over, we can wrap up.
I want to point out one of the questions we have on here, and maybe 2 of them. Well, we do have a question in the chat now. Will state and local governments be implementing this?
That all goes back to the DoD contract again, if they have a contract with the DoD. For example, a good example of this is your state universities. I worked at a state university before I came to Redspin, and they have lots of DoD research contracts, and they've been preparing for the last 18 months to get ready for their CMMC Level 3 assessment. So yes, depending on the contract, definitely there will be state and local governments, if they got DoD contracts, will need to be CMMC level 1 or 3 certified, depending upon the contract.
Any other questions from anyone? Again, feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself and put your camera on if you're comfortable, but we want to try and make sure we cover your questions before we move on. While we're waiting, Tony, just thinking about, if Synergistic has worked with somebody that's on the phone already, does that mean that we can't do a CMMC consultancy with them, or that we can't certify them at some point in the future?
Yes, very good point. This comes back to the conflict of interest issue. So if you've been working with Synergistic, when it comes to, we talked about risk assessments or any other validation work, any of that work, we cannot be your assessor. In other words, we cannot be your C3PO to come in and assess you for CMMC certification. However, we can, under our RPO badge, remember we talked about that earlier, registered provider organization, as a consultant, we can continue consulting with you, which would be a good idea. And we would just pivot and help you with the consulting required to become ready for your CMMC certification. So we can do consulting all day and all night long for you, whether it's related to CMMC or other consulting services we provide. Also, afterwards, we cannot, if we did certify you, or we conduct the assessment for certification, we cannot conduct services for you up to 2 years. I think it's 2 years right now. There's been talk about 3 years, 2 years afterwards. The reason why is, because once again, it's a conflict of interest issue, is if you didn't pass your level 3 certification and we turned around and helped you remediate, well, then it's a conflict of interest. So it's on the front end and back end. So in the front end, if we've been consulting for you, we cannot be your assessor for certification. On the back end, if we were your assessor, we cannot consult. Confusing, I know, but that's DoD for you.
So I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I'm going to ask one final thing to wrap up thoughts I have on this, Tony. What can I do to start preparing immediately? Well, for me, I think step one would be, if you're not sure that CMMC is going to apply to you, do a little more research and digging, because you don't want to be caught at the last minute trying to get all of this together and be prepared and get certified. So really, do some of that digging and ask some of those questions of others in your organization if you don't know the answer that might know the answer, and try to figure that piece out. Now, if you do know that you're going to have to be CMMC certified, one of the things that I think would be helpful, and Tony, if you disagree, please, I know you'll chime in, but to look at your HIPAA risk assessment process and look at the CMMC criteria and do some comparison between the two to think about, okay, what might have already been covered in past assessments? Did we do well there? Did we do poorly there? Are we going to have to shore that up if we didn't do well there? And then think about that validation process that's going to have to occur under CMMC that you might not have done under any of your current practices under HIPAA. So those are a couple of my thoughts on kind of what folks can do to start preparing immediately. Tony?
Right. Yes, back on that point about going back to your risk assessment. Those enterprise level requirements, let's go back to personnel security again. More than likely, obviously, that is a domain under your risk assessment. You should have been assessed. Your personnel security domain should have been assessed. So if you did well there, hopefully you did well there, then you just you launch from that to ensure you got those CMMC hooks in there. So you go to that CMMC assessment guide for level 3 and see where that crosswalk takes you and ensure that you have those CMMC hooks. I gave that example earlier about your HR department having that well-established process, and that may have been carried over in your risk assessment, saying, hey, this is a low-risk area because you got this all set, you're solid in this area. Now you take that and you build upon that. I mentioned that earlier. If you have a strong IT governance program, stay with it, put the hooks into it. So that's where you have that commonality from that perspective.
Yeah, and one additional thought for me is going back to something I mentioned earlier is know where your data is. You're not going to be successful in HIPAA. You're not going to be successful in CMMC. You're really not going to be successful in truly protecting data under any regulatory provision if you don't know what the data is and where you have it. So really think about, if you're not currently doing that, getting a strong handle on where your data lives, and then really thinking about how you might have to re-emphasize to individuals where they can store data, how they can transmit that data, what they can do with it. Because again, I come from most of my career in academic medical centers, and we routinely had people, residents, fellows, faculty, and others who were putting data on devices that weren't appropriate, who were sharing data to cloud services because they wanted a colleague to see something. And so those types of things are going to be even more important when you think about CMMC.
Sure. It's a good point. And going back to, what do you need to start doing to prepare immediately? And you hit on that point, Marty, about knowing your data. And you really do need to know your data, even if you don't have a copy of the contract. First thing you should try to do is get a copy of that contract that you're currently on, and did they actually put those clauses, CMMC clauses in there, or a contract you're going to bid on, and are those CMMC clauses in there? Because that will specify your portion of that contract, whether you need to protect FCI or CUI. If you don't have that contract, learn the definitions of FCI and CUI to determine where you fall. If you're making parts, you're developing blueprints, you're doing medical research, you got any kind of intellectual property, you're going to be CUI. If you're providing services, like we talked about, food deployment services, you're delivering vaccines somewhere to the field, you're delivering janitorial services on a military installation, that's FCI level 1. You can at least start from there and get ready and start looking for those contracts you're going to bid on. And so that, that goes back to the, know your data and what is the classification of that data, then start getting familiar with that CMMC assessment guide. There's 2 guides. There's one for level 1 and level 3. Get very familiar with those.
Yeah, and if there are no more questions, I just want to thank everyone for your participation. I hope you found this helpful. Obviously, if you come up with other questions that you might want to ask us as you step away from this, feel free to reach out to Tony or I. Tony's obviously the much more technical expert on CMMC, but I'm happy to answer any questions or collaborate with him to get the answer for you. Or I'm going to volunteer, Tony, you can reach out to him as well. But again, I just want to thank you for your participation.
Yep, well, that concludes our session. Thanks, Tony and Marty. And again, thank you to everyone that joined us today. And the recording will be available in the event lobby by the end of today. And don't forget to join us for our 4th session next week on building blocks to stay one step ahead of your opponent. And have a great day. Thank you.